Welcome to the 2020 GDS Novice States Counterplan Lecture. We're going to review the basics of counterplans, then discuss variations of the state's counterplan, including some examples with specific counterplan text. We're going to talk about possible net benefits to the state's counterplan, then affirmative strategy, and then I'm going to give a few tips about debating the state's counterplan in each speech, starting with the negative block. All right, section 1, let's review some of the counterplan basics. Every counterplan should have a text, a statement of what the counterplan does, should have solvency, at least an argument, hopefully some evidence, and even more hopefully a solvency advocate proving the counterplan will work to solve the affirmative advantages. Third, every counterplan should have a net benefit, usually a disadvantage, it could be a critique, could be turns on an advantage or an internal net benefit. Just to be clear before the debate what the net benefits are going to be, and as strategy changes throughout the debate, you continue to have a clear vision of the net benefit. All right, section 2. Let's talk about some sample state counterplans. Variations on states use examples progressing from most basic states counterplan to the most abusive theoretical counterplans, all in an attempt to solve the affirmative. You know, it makes strategic sense that if you don't need, that you would want to minimize the theoretical objections to your counterplan. And so we're going to kind of go along the lines of the most basic state counterplan to progressively more abusive counterplans that will be vulnerable to theory arguments against them. So for these examples, we're going to use the treatment court's plan text as our starting point, assuming the affirmative read both the cartels and the manufacturing advantages. So the plan for those debates is the United States federal government should create an accreditation program for drug court expansion that requires universal screening, objective metrics for admission, and tiered evidence-based treatment programs. All right, counterplan 1. We're just going to call this the basic counterplan, and I'm not going to do this anymore, but in this instance, I wanted you to kind of note how the negative team really just mimics what the plan text does and exchanges the United States federal government for the 50 United States. So instead of the United States federal government creating the accreditation program for drug court expansion that requires universal screening, objective metrics for admission, and tiered evidence-based treatment programs, the only difference between these counterplan texts is that the United States federal government is substituted out and exchanged for the states. And that's, you know, a relatively common counterplan, and it often works very effectively, and you don't have to do anything to make it better. If that doesn't work, we've got counterplan 2. This merely adds the phrase sub-federal entities. And I think I may have, it probably works if you say the 50 states and relevant sub-federal governments, but the original way this was written in the counterplan in the packet that you have, and a probably more common way of writing this counterplan, instead of using the phrase sub-federal governments, it would use sub-federal entities. Again, though, if it's not a government entity, that also would subject people to even, you know, there might be like, what is the difference between government and entities? And so we'll talk more about the theory components of these, but that's just something for you to be aware of it. And again, this is an instance of a counterplan that doesn't change anything except for the agent, the United States federal government versus the 50 states and relevant sub-federal governments, and then just mimic the plan text. Well, and let's talk a little bit more about what sub-federal entities are. The most obvious ones are the District of Columbia and territories like Guam. It could maybe also include native lands. And the Neg adds these to respond to solvency deficits in those areas. So if you used our basic version of the state's counterplan, there's a possibility that your counterplan doesn't solve for, say, Guam. And if the affirmative can create a solvency deficit from that, then you've got a problem with your counterplan. And so I would say most of the time in modern high school policy debate, if they read the state's counterplan, they include something that references DC, territories, sub-federal entities, whether or not they use that phrase or not. Okay. Our next example is the same counterplan, but they added one thing. And so it looks a little bit different only because I subdivided it. And I used a phrase that I talked about in my advanced counterplan lecture, the phrase including but not limited to, which gives you a little bit of leeway in interpreting what exactly your counterplan does, as long as it stays relatively within the mandates of what you're doing here. But really what we're going to focus on is the thing at the bottom there that starts with massively increased funding for drug treatment programs available to anyone who seeks treatment. The negative added this third plank to solve treatment beyond those people who are sent to drug courts, which can help solve the manufacturing advantage. So even, let's say, for example, that the affirmative has a solvency deficit related to federal drug courts. So like obviously the state's counterplan can't do anything, and every person that is in a federal court won't be redirected to a treatment court in the world of the counterplan, which is a potential solvency deficit. However, this plank creates treatment options for those people who are willing to participate in just drug treatment. And given that the affirmative is saying, and you can kind of set these kinds of things up in cross-examination by saying, well, just because you put them in treatment courts and they're allowed to, you know, instead of going to prison, to undertake treatment programs, you know, are people really willing to do that? And if you can get the affirmative to say, yeah, of course, most people don't really want to be drug addicts, and if they just had access to the appropriate care, then they would, you know, get treatment. And so if that's true, then this plank of the counterplan solves all those problems and therefore solves, you know, both the manufacturing and the cartel's advantage. Okay, counterplan 4, the state bar associations. So this counterplan, and again, basically in most instances, looking at the slide, it's going to be everything is the same from the previous counterplan except for the very last plank, which in this instance is the one that says convince state bar associations to decertify any attorneys prosecuting drug crimes. This is a tricky plank aimed at solving all the federal government action is important warrants, which is often referred to as Fed key, i.e. the federal government is key to solving this problem. And so debate shorthand is just Fed key. Because you can't practice law without being certified by the State Bar Association, and most attorneys want to be certified in at least one state, this is probably a pretty good mechanism to solve, since it would stop anyone from being convicted of drug crimes. I say anyone, there are probably some attorneys that only practice in federal courts, or, you know, they aren't really worried about losing their license because they don't actually appear in court. But the vast majority of attorneys do. And so state bar associations stopped granting the right to practice law in their particular state to attorneys that were prosecuting drug crimes. The number of attorneys who would be willing to prosecute drug crimes would drastically fall. And so again, that's aimed at solving some of the Fed key warrants related to, like, for example, I know that there's one that says that it's illegal to give prescriptions for certain drugs. Well, there'd be a lot more of those drugs distributed if people didn't have to worry about being prosecuted for distributing those particular drugs. All right. So counterplan 5 is have the states legalize drugs. And so the last plank of this counterplan is to fully legalize drugs and end all cooperation with federal authorities who attempt to prosecute drug crimes. This plank is not just a legalized drug advantages, which means basically the only people that would be left going into, court accused of drug accused of drug crimes would be people in federal court. And in this instance, because the drug is legal in, say, Texas, and so if you're in Texas and federal authorities try to, capture you, hold you, take you places, the counterplan mandates that all of the state authorities would not cooperate with you. And while the federal government has massive resources overall compared to the states, they don't have the resources to really conduct the war on drugs the way that they would like, absent state cooperation. So if all of a sudden state cooperation dried up, the number of people that could even theoretically be prosecuted for drug crimes is going to go way, way, way down. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the net benefit, but this particular counterplan is also aiming to create the net benefit of uncooperative federalism. All right, let's move to counterplan 6. And in this instance, the very last plank of the counterplan is to fully fund massive transportation infrastructure and STEM initiatives. The Neg added this plank to solve all the economy internal links from the manufacturing advantage. There's good evidence that transportation and STEM is really key to the economy and hegemony. So this plank functions much like an advantage counterplan. It's just, it has the states fund the transportation infrastructure and the STEM initiatives that would result in a better economy and better hegemony, and solves the manufacturing advantage. And so like I said, it kind of functions as an advantage counterplan in that sense. Counterplan 7, Lopez. So in this instance, the last plank of the counterplan is not the relevant one. And I bolded right at the beginning where the counterplan says the United States federal government should devolve all authority over drug crimes to the 50 states and relevant sub-federal governments in the United States. So what this does, and I think I already said that this is what Mr. Katyal talked about, it has the federal government say, you know what, we are not going to deal with drugs anymore. We're going to leave those issues to the states, and we're going to devolve or move the power from the higher level of government to a lower level of government, in this instance, the states. And then the counterplan has the states mimic what the federal government was going to do. And so that would essentially mean there are no longer federal drug crimes. It is obviously vulnerable to theory arguments about multi-level fiat, but it is very likely to solve most of the federal key warrants, if not all of them. This version of the counterplan might also reduce the need to read all the other planks. It might be sufficient to just devolve power and then mimic the plan. For the most part, and again, this is something I talked about in the advanced counterplan lecture, but it's something to keep in mind, is that a big counterplan like this, the more planks that you add doesn't necessarily mean you become more theoretically abusive. And once you've taken the step that you're going to use multi-actor fiat, that's the most likely theory argument that you would hear. And so all those other things that you're doing aren't relevant. Like, it's not more theoretically abusive because it does more things. It's more theoretically abusive because of things like using state power and federal power at the same time. And so, the big counterplan that does a lot of things isn't any more abusive. That's not where the problem lies. The theoretical objections come from other things, like using both federal fiat and state fiat in the same counterplan. And so I would, as long as you're clear that none of the planks that you've added link to the net benefit or are going to cause the net benefit, and you can clearly explain that the counterplan does these things, the plan does these things, and this thing that the plan does will cause the disadvantage or is what links to the critique, and the counterplan doesn't do anything like that, as long as that's clear in your mind, you can add as many planks to your counterplan as you want. And in fact, you probably should. Like, why wouldn't you want your counterplan to solve as well as possible? And we will talk about solvency advocate theory, and the more planks you add, the less likely it is that you have solvency advocates for all of them. And so that's kind of another thing. But again, that's an objection to not having the solvency advocate. If you have solvency advocates for all the planks in the counterplan, then that's not the problem. And once you have one plank that doesn't have a solvency advocate, then the theory debate's basically going to be the same. And so there's little risk in adding 3 or 4 planks that don't have solvency advocates, maybe a tiny bit more risk in that instance. Okay, let's go to section 3, which is possible net benefits to the counterplan. The most common arguments about net benefits are the politics disadvantage, the federalism disadvantage, and uncooperative federalism. Okay, let's start with politics. Because the counterplan is at the state level, it arguably wouldn't affect the upcoming 2020 elections or future political capital needs of Congress to pass certain legislation. I think that's pretty straightforward. Federalism is the argument that United States federal government in this area disrupts the proper balance of power between the states and federal government. The uniqueness for this disadvantage is usually terrible. Like in this instance, there already are federal drug crimes, and so they already have taken that power. And so sometimes the Lopez version of the counterplan is used as uniqueness counterplan, meaning if things are out of balance now, and the counterplan takes some of the power that the federal government has now and gives that back to the states, that puts things in balance, which means the permutation would continue to imbalance things. And so the counterplan alone is the best way to provide a proper balance for federalism. Doing the permutation and doing these things together, the plan and the counterplan together, would not provide the appropriate balance for federalism. Uncooperative federalism is kind of the opposite of this argument, although they're not completely inconsistent in that it's really more that the question of who should have this power is less relevant, and the important part of uncooperative federalism is that the federal government isn't an effective entity and or is an immoral agent. This argument got a lot stronger after Trump was elected, and lots of authors started writing articles about how the states should start defying the federal government because the federal policies are immoral. This was a very strong argument on the immigration topic, and could be very strong on this topic also for similar reasons. Like, you know, when Trump starts putting babies in cages because they came from Mexico or Latin America, that isn't something that seems right. And therefore, if a state provides sanctuary, like the sanctuary cities did, and there lots of authors were like, the states and these cities should not cooperate with federal authorities, and they shouldn't give information to ICE so that they can raid places where they think there's immigrants, etc. And in the same way, a lot of the federal actions that are seen as racist, because probably they are racist, are reasons why the states should step up and say, you know what, we're not going to participate, we're not going to help you in your racist activities, and we should not cooperate with the federal government in those areas. And as I explained before, because the federal government is very reliant on law enforcement officials in states and localities, if those states and localities stopped cooperating, then the federal government wouldn't be able to implement, you know, whatever policies that are causing these harms. Okay, let's talk about affirmative strategy. So we always start with POTS. Most of the time, when we're debating counterplans, we want to make sure that we have a permutation, that we have offense against the counterplan, that we make theory arguments against the counterplan, and that we establish solvency deficits against the counterplan. We're also going to conclude this section of the lecture talking about cross-examination and reality moments. So we should almost always make a permutation against counterplans, and against the state's counterplan, one argument that we make, and we shouldn't really just say perm, cue the plan and the counterplan. That is, I mean, it's good that we made a perm, but that is kind of the weakest version of a perm. It's so much better if you can justify why that's a good idea. So permutation, do the plan and the counterplan together, creates double solvency. This argument is effective when combined with a deontology argument, or we need every increment of solvency possible. You have to be a little bit careful with this, because if they kick the counterplan, then you may be stuck with a solvency deficit. So again, the way that this would get executed in a debate is you would say permutation, do the plan and the counterplan together. That creates double solvency, and you'd insert some warrant from your 1AC about why trying to solve this problem as much as possible would be great. That works great with if you have a racism advantage, you know. So having the federal government and the states cooperate to solve these problems as fast as possible is the best option. But if you go too far down that track, you have to worry that the negative might kick their counterplan, and they'd be like, your argument that said double solvency is important proves that the plan alone doesn't solve all these problems. And so just want to be, I don't think that that's a huge danger in most instances, but you do want to, you know, just be careful how strongly worded your double solvency argument is. All right, next let's talk about offense against counterplans. So you almost always need some. There's exceptions, but in general, after you hear a counterplan, if you can't figure out what your offense is going to be, you should take a little bit more prep time and figure it out. Something you could win the debate on, like solvency deficits, turns on the net benefit, or theory. All of those things are offense because there are ways you could win the debate. Theoretically, the affirmative can also read disadvantages to the counterplan, but usually they aren't very good, and or the good ones require a big time investment. And if the counterplan is conditional, then they can kick the counterplan, which makes the DA go away. So, you know, a relatively common disadvantage against the state's counterplan is something related to California, because California has a big economy, they're a big state, and you know, you can write disadvantages that you can have a decent chance to win an internal link that might have an impact that outweighs the disadvantage that the negative is reading against your plan. Well, the problem is to set that up might take 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute, maybe even 90 seconds. And then the negative stands up in the 2NC is like, the California disad. Well, we're kicking the counterplan, so it's not relevant anymore. And now a minute and a half of your 2AC was wasted time. And so theoretically, the disadvantage to the counterplan is a great idea, but strategically speaking, if the counterplan is conditional, it might not be worth that time investment. The 2AC can also read add-ons, but it's tough to find additional advantages that counterplan doesn't solve unless you have some very specific evidence about a precedent your plan sets that would lead to other actions not related to the plan, or if you have some kind of a modeling advantages. There are instances of these things happening, but most of the time, the negative can counterplan out of those things, and then you're back in the same place that you were before, which is you spend a bunch of time reading something, and then they stand up in the 2NC and they're like, add a plank to our counterplan to do X. That solves the new add-on that they read. And so, you know, again, those are things you should think about, and maybe there are things that 2ACs do that can help them win debates, but they definitely don't come without strategic risks. Okay, let's talk about theory. The first thing I want to say about this, and it's just good advice for almost every theory debate, which is make targeted theory arguments. Try to make your arguments as specific to this particular debate, and if possible, if you can combine theoretical arguments. For example, don't just say agent counterplans are bad, say conditional agent counterplans are bad, and justify that. And that means that when they read their conditionality good arguments or their agent counterplans good arguments, you can say, look, we haven't said conditionality is bad, we haven't said agent counterplans are bad, we've said the combination of agent counterplans with conditionality is uniquely bad. And you can, in that way, if they don't adjust to the 2AC strategy decision that you made to make a targeted theory argument, then then you should be ahead in that debate. It also helps, I think, if you make it specific. If you talk about, in this debate, if we read this argument, which we would normally read against the counterplan, and they have the ability to kick it, then they could use those arguments against us. And so we're not really accomplishing, like conditionality blocks will often say things like it creates the best policymaking. It's like, it's not very good policymaking if we can't make our best arguments against their counterplan. And these arguments prove why conditionality is bad. Okay, the next theory argument I want to talk about is no solvency advocate. The negative should be required to have a solvency advocate at least as specific as the affirmative solvency advocate. This will be a particularly good argument against multi-plane counterplans, like the big counterplan I use as the example above. That it's very unlikely that they're going to have evidence that says that states should pressure their bar associations to decertify attorneys. There is some stuff about how state bar associations themselves should take action against attorneys that are part of an unjust war on drugs or an immoral immigration federal authorities. But that is very different than an advocate who says that the state of California should pressure their bar association to do things. And so, as I referenced before, the danger of a big counterplan for the negative isn't how many steps they do, it's how many theoretically abusive things they do. And so, and a solvency advocate is just a really good test of all of these things, because solvency advocates mean when we were researching our affirmative, we should have been able to find arguments that people would make against us. And this conglomeration of things that the negative has come up with isn't anywhere in the literature that we read about, which means there's an education argument against allowing negatives to have these kinds of counterplans. Like, the best debates are debates where there's cards on both sides, and there just aren't going to be cards about this counterplan because nobody advocates this counterplan. Talked a lot about multi-actor fiat already, but there are times where the negative is forced to take both federal and state action. And in those instances, I think there's a very good theory argument against that just being unfair. You can say, look, we get one entity, which is the federal government, and even if we give them the states, that's already 50 different governmental entities, plus how many other sub-federal entities there are, and we really get one. Even if you think that's fair, it's not fair that they get the same one that we do and the 50 states and the federal entities. And so I think that's a powerful argument. And again, you can make that a targeted argument, because you're saying, look, we're not saying they don't get the state's counterplan. They can have, the negative team should get to have the state's counterplan. What they shouldn't get is the state's counterplan and federal action. And I think that that type of targeted theory argument can be very effective. The affirmative could also make an agent counterplans bad argument. Agent counterplans do most, if not all, of the same things the plan does. They just have a different agent, i.e. the states, instead of the federal government, do those actions. This argument isn't great against the states because the states wouldn't use the same mechanisms as the federal government. Agent counterplans bad are much better theory arguments against counterplans that use a different branch of the federal government. Although if the Neg Block makes this argument, the 1AR could respond with arguments about how there aren't actually mechanisms at the state level to do things where the states act uniformly like the counterplan does. This is as good a time as any to talk about counterplan uniformity. Generally, the best arguments against having the states do things is that they wouldn't be consistent in their approach. Like, California would do drug treatment courts one way, and Texas would do drug treatment courts a completely different way. And to deal with this, the negative often fiats uniformity, because the affirmative against the counterplan is going to say, look, Texas is really going to mess this up. Like, California might do it great, but Texas will be terrible. And there's 25,000 drug offenders every year in Texas, which means you have a huge solvency deficit in Texas or whatever. So the negative then is just like, we will have every state do all of their programs exactly the same. In this instance, the affirmative can argue that it isn't educational since it's not how the states actually work, and that it links to the federalism disadvantage because the point of federalism is that states are laboratories of innovation, i.e. they try different things and the things that end up working are copied by similar states. It might be possible, it could be, in fact, it's very likely true, that the type of drug treatment courts that would work in Texas are not the same as the way drug treatment courts would work in California. And that's supposed to be why the impacts to the federalism DA usually assume that different states would be doing different things. Well, once the negative fiats that they all do things the same way in order to resolve the Fed key warrants, that results in then that causes the federalism disadvantage because they're no longer innovating at the state level. And both of those arguments are good 1AR extensions to the Neg Block arguments that they fiat uniformity. So to kind of walk how this would work, the 2AC is like, the states are failing now. The reasons why the states fail is because they're not uniform and they'll never create uniformity. The 2NC then says, well, we fiat uniformity. We have all the states do the same thing in all the same ways. And then the 1AR can say, first of all, that's an uneducational theoretical practice and should be rejected because that's not really how the states do things. Even when the states agree to do certain things, like there are occasional examples that the negative can use to say that there have been situations where lots of different states got together and created an agreement that they were all going to tackle some issue. They still left themselves the flexibility to implement those ideas in a bunch of different ways. And the negative is like, yeah, we're not going to allow them to do that, which means it's not accurately representing what's in the literature and what type of debate we should be having. Additionally, so that's a theoretical reason to reject the counterplan. And additionally, if the negative block goes for the federalism disadvantage, the 1AR can say, and this also means they don't win their federalism disadvantage because the internal links to the impacts on their federalism disadvantage are innovation, and there's no innovation when they fiat uniformity. All right, one last thing I wanted to talk about here was the sub-federal entities. When I was writing that section about the counterplan for the negative, I got to thinking that I could also see where a negative could say this includes cities and counties, because it doesn't say sub-federal. Even if it said sub-federal government, if it says sub-federal entities, I'm curious about what those entities are that aren't government. I referred to this before, which seems another theoretical objection is like, now it's not just that you're getting the government, but you're also starting to fiat private entities. Like that could be, oh, we're going to fiat. It's not just that we're going to pressure the state bar associations, we're actually going to fiat that the state bar associations do these things, even though they're not a governmental organization, or we're going to fiat that Microsoft will give a bunch of money, or, you know, that once you say entities instead of governments, you've really opened the door. And so you should ask some cross-ex questions if that phrase is in the counterplan. Like, what exactly do you mean by sub-federal entities? Even if they use the phrase sub-federal governments, cities and counties are sub-federal governments. And so it's another place where in cross-examination, you want to clarify, wait a second, are you saying you fiat states, counties, and cities? Because again, now look at all the different levels of government that they're using versus the affirmative is stuck with one unit of government, the federal government. And so I think, again, there's a very strong theoretical argument that the affirmative gets one level of government, the negative should only get one level of government. And kind of the phrasing I use for that is it creates a more equitable competition space because each side gets one level of government. Okay, so the next thing in our acronym of POTS is the S, solvency deficit. Solvency deficits are frustrating arguments in debate because you can read a really, really good article about why the federal government needs to take action, and then you read that evidence, and then the negative just writes their counterplan to fiat out of that. And it's a really frustrating thing as a 2AC when you think I have this awesome evidence. And again, like uniformity is the best example. That's just like the states do not act in a uniform fashion. And Georgia, you know, has way less money than Texas does. And so they've tried to do some treatment courts, but they don't have enough money. So it's terrible. And then the neg is just like, we just fiat that they change their budget and they spend a bunch of money in Georgia on this. Or we fiat that Texas gives Georgia money, or there's just like all kinds of crazy things they do. Now, the crazier they get, you can start, that's where the solvency advocate theory argument that we talked about before comes into play. But generally speaking, negatives would rather debate out the theory than have a solvency deficit. And so they're going to do some things like that every once in a while. And you just can't get frustrated about it. You just have to kind of see the opportunities that opens up for you. One other solvency argument that you might make, especially on this topic, where a lot of affirmatives will have racism or structural violence advantages, there's decent arguments that the states are more racist than the federal government. Although, that argument has gotten tougher to win given the current administration at the federal level. And at most might get you some kind of circumvention arguments, which might also be used against your AF if you aren't careful. This is the same thing. You've always got to be aware of the status of the counterplan. And if the counterplan is conditional and your circumvention arguments are too strong, then there's a possibility that the negative will kick the counterplan and use those against you. Like if the state of Georgia would circumvent state action, what do you think they're going to do when the federal government tries to make them do things? And so that's a place that, it's a possibility to create solvency deficits, but it's one that you have to kind of be careful about. And again, depending on your affirmative, those solvency deficits are going to be different. And the debate nomenclature for that is Fed key warrants. You're constantly looking for reasons why the federal government does things that the states can't do, like in drug treatment courts, the argument that we've referred to before about there's some of the drugs needed for treatment are illegal under federal law to be prescribed except for certain circumstances, and the state's counterplan can't overturn that unless they do Lopez and devolve that authority. And so that's a good Fed key warrant. It's not an unbeatable Fed key warrant, but it's a good one, because in one way to think about that is that the more Fed key warrants you have, the more likely that there will either be a solvency deficit or the negative will have to do something theoretically abusive that, if you make a good targeted theory argument, will be a real danger to the 2NR. Okay, so so now we're going to move into the using cross-examination to help your affirmative strategy. I mean, and actually this is a little bit, I guess I should talk about both the affirmative and the negative. So on the negative side, you want to ask questions about what are the internal links to these problems. So for example, if you, on the manufacturing advantage, they're like, the reason why we need fewer drug addicts is so that we can have better workers. The reason we need better workers is to help manufacturing so we can have a strong economy, so we can have hegemony. Well, if that's true, counterplans like STEM initiatives or drug treatment programs, those kinds of things the states could do, and they would resolve the economic problems, the hegemony problems, the drug addiction problems. And so we don't really need to do the plan. And so questions that you ask about internal links are always questions that you can use for counterplans in general, or in this instance, things that the states could do that would solve these problems. On the affirmative side, you want to ask questions that undermine, that first of all clarify how theoretically abusive the counterplan is, but also then does it link to disadvantages? For example, doesn't uniformity undermine the internal links to your innovation, laboratories of innovation internal link to your federalism disadvantage? Or if you do the Lopez counterplan, isn't that federal action, and isn't your link to your politics disadvantage federal action? Those kinds of questions can be short questions, and you shouldn't spend too much time on them, but you should just get the judge thinking about that idea. You want to give your opponents a little bit of time to answer them, but in reality, all you're trying to do is get the seed of that argument planted in your judge's mind. So when that argument's made in the 2AC or the 1AR, they'll remember that that argument was set up in cross-examination. All right, the last part of section 4 is about reality moments. The counterplan that I've written probably solves the affirmative. It just does. And so to continue making uniformity arguments or continuing to make these Fed key warrants, you're just beating a dead horse, and it's not going to work. That, if they read counterplan 1, basic states counterplan, then those arguments might be really good. If they read counterplan 7 that includes Lopez, the vast majority, if not all of those arguments are toast. And so you have to recognize that. And so you have to recognize that there will be times where you have to go for theory, or you have to go for turns on the net benefit. You have to impact turn to disadvantage, something like that. And so you have to make sure that those arguments are in the 2AC. And so, after you hear the counterplan, you have to listen carefully, and you can't just think to yourself, oh, this is the state's counterplan. Well, it might be the state's counterplan, but it might be a very different state's counterplan than you heard 15 debates ago, or you heard at camp. If you beat the state's counterplan, teams are going to pay attention to that, and they're going to figure out, well, how did they beat our state's counterplan? And they're going to probably change their counterplan to adjust to that. All right, section 5, the Neg Block. As is always good advice, don't try to go for too much. Don't try to go for too much. If you have a good counterplan and the state's counterplan has a good chance of solving the affirmative, win the counterplan. You don't need the case anymore. Win the counterplan. Now, generally, it's a good idea to have offense in the 2 and C, which would mean you would probably do a disadvantage, or maybe sometimes a critique or impact turns, but you want to think about having offense in the 2 and C most of the time. If you decide to have the 1NR do the DA, that's your net benefit, that's fine, but you should probably plan for them to spend all 5 minutes on it, because if you don't win the net benefit, you're not going to win your counterplan hardly ever, and you shouldn't ever do it. You'll only do it if there's execution errors by your opponents, and we certainly don't want to count on that. So make sure that they have sufficient time to win it. And if you decide to do the counterplan in the 2 and C, you might also decide to go for a few case arguments. You can, you don't want to try to maybe do 20 or 30 case arguments on the counterplan, because you want to make sure you have time to win the counterplan. But it's okay to say, you know what, I'm going to do the counterplan, and then I'm going to go to solvency. And then, if you do 1 solvency argument in your speech, or you do 3 solvency arguments in your speech, doesn't really matter, but you have a plan that's flexible, but your priority is to win the counterplan. If you do any overview at all on the state's counterplan, it should be very short. Make a quick explanation of how it solves the case. If there's something tricky about your state's counterplan, or there's some argument that you think is important, like, for example, a lot of judges will not have heard and not maybe understand that there's federal laws about what drugs physicians can prescribe, and that those drugs are important for treatment. Okay, well, how does your counterplan solve that? And you don't want to leave it and hope that the judge just doesn't understand that argument, and then let the 2AR stand up and extend their piece of evidence and explain that argument, and the judge to be like, yeah, you just don't solve because you can't solve this federal drug prescriptions argument. That's like an important argument, and it's tricky. So you might want to say, hey, they're going to say their solvency deficit is going to be this, and here's why our counterplan solves that. That's a good use of an overview. Normally, you don't want your overview to interfere with your line by line, and you want to explain those arguments on the line by line. But because this is a complicated argument and you want to make sure the judge understands it, that's okay. But then that's all you're going to do there. You're going to say, this is their best solvency deficit, and this is why it's not a problem for us, because our counterplan does this, which solves that problem. While I generally think you should try to do the rule of 3 to 1, i.e. 3 arguments against every 2AC answer, there will be times where the only answer to the perm is that it links to the disadvantage. So You know, in the 2 and C, you're going to say, they say permutation do both. That permutation links to our disadvantage, so it's not a net beneficial option. You should prefer the counterplan alone. That's the only argument you need. And so then you go to 2AC2, whatever that argument is. There are often follow-on arguments that if the states prove something is successful, then the federal government will copy it. These are great cards to read in the 2 and C because it really destroys any of the Fed key warrants. So kind of think of it as all the states do something, the federal government recognizes that these drug treatment courts are working really, really well at the state level, and so they decide to mimic that program, and that means the federal government then does the plan. And once the federal government does the plan, it's not something that the negative team is fiating, it's something they're reading solvency for. And that's an incredibly powerful argument to answer all of the federal key warrants. All right, now let's talk about the Neg Block, or the 1AR, section 6, 1AR. And I'm a little bit behind on my slides, sorry about that. I'll give you just a second. And the only thing I really wrote there anyway was don't go for too much. All right. So section 6, the 1AR. Before the debate, if you think your opponents are going to go for the state's counterplan, you should talk with your partner about your strategy against the state's counterplan. That strategy can always change, but that means as soon as the 1NR is over, you can say things like, is the strategy still the same? And if not, then you can talk about how things need to change. Do not try to win every 2AC argument against the counterplan in the 1AR. Instead, pick a couple of arguments to extend and make sure you respond to every response made against it in the Neg Block. This is what we call micro line by line. So in a good debate, the 2AC is going to make 5 to 10 arguments against the counterplan. The 2 and C is going to make 3 arguments against almost all of those arguments, if not all of those arguments, maybe not the perm. But on your theory argument, for example, if they did Lopez and you're like, Lopez is 2 levels of government and that fiat is unfair, then the negative team should definitely have at least 3 responses to that. And you're not going to win that argument if in the 1AR, you don't stop and say, extend our argument that multi-level fiat is unfair. They said this, and here's our answers to that. They said this, and here's our answers to that. They said this, and here's our answers to that. And so the debate has fewer arguments in it, but those arguments have more development. And that's a really important part of being good in the 1AR. So go for fewer arguments, but make sure that you fully answer all the negative block responses to those arguments. Also, remember your reality moments. There will be a lot of times that the only thing you extend against the counterplan is a shadow extension of the permutation and a theory argument, because you are then going to go to the net benefit and turn it. And so, and just shadow extension is the idea that you're not really going to do what I just said you should do, which is micro line by line, but you want to make sure that the permutation is in the 1AR. So you're just going to, you're going to be like, the counterplan, extend the permutation. There's no reason we can't do both the state action and the federal action at the same time. Now, drop down to multi-actor fiat bad. And that's where you do a full extension, not a shadow extension. And then you're done on the counterplan because you've already figured out this counterplan solves our affirmative. There's just like, we could beat our head against the wall, but it's not going to do us any good. We're never going to win any of our solvency deficits. So we're better off just to spend our time on the counterplan on the theory argument. You're then going to go to their net benefit and you're going to try to turn it in some way and create your offense there. And so that's going to make the amount of time that you debate the counterplan very limited, but very strategic. Because I mentioned follow-on in the 2 and C, I thought I'd quickly mention for the 1AR that if the block argues that there will be follow-on by the federal government and you plan to go for solvency deficits, you must answer this argument. Like if they say the federal government will follow on and you drop it, that is an incredibly common way that negative teams win on the state's counterplan, because they'll say the 1AR conceded our arguments that the federal government will follow state action when it's successful. We've won that the states will effectively implement our plans. that means the federal government will follow it, and we solve all their Fed key warrants now. The most common way you're going to answer this argument is the Trump administration won't follow any of these asks. They are not going to do these kinds of things, particularly when the affirmative is a kind of liberal policy, which then means the counterplan is a liberal policy. The Trump administration is not going to follow that on. Now, depending on how the election turns out, that'll be a different question. And in those instances, you'll probably, if Biden wins the election and he may or may not follow on, then you're going to have to make some time frame. He might be ideologically inclined to follow on, but that doesn't mean that the Senate will be ideologically inclined to follow on. Or, right now the House seems a little bit more progressive, or a lot more progressive, but even they might not choose to follow on. And if they do, it will take a long time. And it certainly is not the same thing as uniform fiat. And so the affirmative team can say, look, we get to fiat our plan is done. If our plan isn't fiated, then there will never be follow on. The most important part about that is don't drop it. If you drop it, your chances of winning are low. All right, section 7. Let's talk about the 2NR. Do the net benefit first. Usually it's going to be a disadvantage, but whatever it is, you want to win. That's your offense. Counterplans are really, really, really good defense, but counterplans without net benefits are just defense. And in debate, offense wins championships. So, if you lose the DA and that's your net benefit, you can't win. If you lose the counterplan, you might still win. The DA is more important than the case, so you could still win. That's why you want to do it first. If it's realistic, explain how the DA turning the case offsets any solvency deficit. If you think the counterplan really solves all the case, use any risk of the DA analysis. That's the kind of overview where you say, look, we solve 100% of the case, so we don't have to win very much of a risk of our disadvantage, and we should still win. If we win any risk, the counterplan solves 100%, so a 0.0001 risk of our disadvantage is enough to vote on. Now, if you think the counterplan solves some of the case, but there might be some solvency deficits that you're worried about, and again, this is, reality moments is constantly a part of debate of figuring out what are we winning, what are we not winning, and the 2NR where we're winning everything, those 2NRs are very rarely accurate. You have to kind of accept that your opponents are going to win some arguments and have reality moments. Are they winning these particular arguments? And if they're winning some solvency deficit arguments, then you want to use sufficiency framing for your counterplan. You want to talk about, hey, even if we don't solve all the case, we solve a lot of the case, and we have a disadvantage with a big impact. And so you should view the counterplan through the lens of sufficiency, that we solve a sufficient amount of the case. If you don't think the counterplan solves much of the affirmative, then you should probably kick it and go for the case. If it was unconditional, then you can do the fake go for it, where you say something like, the counterplan is unconditional, so we are going for it. It doesn't really solve the case, but it doesn't link to the DA. And so we're going to win, but the DA outweighs and turns the case. And we're, there you go. And so those are kind of the ways you're going to set up your 2NR and the ways to think about your 2NR. And again, you're going to view that through the lens of reality moments. What is the reality of, and that's just a really, really important part of debate, is learning, are we really winning our counterplan or are we not? And then adjusting accordingly. All right, the 2AR. Make choices. So the 2AC against the counterplan starts out with somewhere between 5 and 10 arguments, and the 1AR narrows that down to 2, 3, maybe 4 arguments at the most. Well, the 2AR then can narrow it even further. You might consider just going for the perm and double solvency if they didn't answer that very well. This can be particularly effective if you have a solvency deficit and you have a more kind of morality or ethics or deontology kind of argument like racism. If you can win that the judge has an obligation to solve as much racism as they possibly can, then the permutation might be a good option. And again, you're then going to do micro line by line with that. You're going to say, and I think I'll say this now, which is start with arguments the 1AR made. You don't want judges saying, oh, that's a really awesome argument you spent a minute on in the 2AR. That argument was not extended in the 1AR. So the first thing that you do is you have a reality moment of what arguments did the 1AR extend, not what arguments do you wish the 1AR had extended. And so, you know, just like the 1AR and 2NR, you have to have reality moments with yourself. If the counterplan solves your affirmative, then you have to go for theory or turns on the net benefit. And, you know, that might be a situation where your 2AR, you don't even try to win the permutation anymore. You're just like, we're going to go for theoretical objections to the counterplan, and then I'm going to spend the rest of my time on the disadvantage or whatever the net benefit is, and I'm going to try to turn that so they can't win any offense and they don't have a net benefit to their counterplan. And again, I'm going to repeat that whichever argument you decide to go for in the 2AR, make sure it was an argument that was in the 1AR, and then respond to every argument the 2NR made against the 1AR extensions of that argument. I think that, you know, if you find yourself saying they didn't even answer this argument, you have to be thinking, well, are they a totally incompetent 2NR, or is it possible that my partner didn't actually extend this argument? Was I paying careful attention and we talked about them extending this argument, but maybe they didn't actually do that? And so that, you know, you need to have a double check. Like, if you think an argument is dropped, you should double check with your partner. Like, I'm just going to go for multi-actor fiat bad. I don't have anything on my flow. Did you make this argument, first of all? And second, if you did, what did they say in response to it? And hopefully, now if you both think, yes, I made that argument, no, they didn't respond to it, then that should be an easy argument for you to win. But my experience has been that debaters use the phrase something was dropped way more than it's actually dropped. So that's the 2AR. Make choices, do micro line by line. And that is the end of my lecture about counterplans. I will go into the Q&A now, and you can ask me whatever questions that you have. Thank you very much.